He said the words, but in totally different context. I mean, this is appalling. I worked for the BBC as a radio reporter for 10 years. I was editing tape day in, day out. I think I can say with some authority, this is not an example of clumsy editing. This looks like a deliberate attempt to deceive. And when you combine that really very shocking edit, as you say, of two different clips that were an hour apart, taken completely out of context, and you combine that, as Panorama did, with sort of slightly edgy music, when you mix it with a whole, in the context of a program that's trying to basically make Donald Trump out to be something of a monster, I think it's completely inexcusable. And as someone that did used to work for the BBC and was very, very proud to work for that organisation, whenever you travelled abroad, you'd say you were from the BBC, and it was like a magic word that unlocked doors, and people would then be very willing to speak to you because they had huge respect for this global organisation. And to see it now sunk so low is actually really very upsetting.
Yeah. But Suzanne, you're talking there about BBC standards, and I used to work for them, and you're absolutely right about that passport around the world. You'd go to South America or Russia or whatever it is, and just doors would open for you when you said you were from the BBC.
The halls of Capitol Hill are vibrating tonight, air thick, voices sharp, because lawmakers aren't just talking anymore. They're moving. Real votes, real text, real consequences. HRES 353 is no longer a rumor. It's a loaded weapon on the House floor. 7 articles aimed straight at the presidency. Reporters rush through the corridors, their footsteps echoing like warning shots. Phones buzz, doors slam, and somewhere deep inside the building, senior members whisper the unthinkable. Trump has to resign. Tonight. Outside, chaos is building. Crowds shouting, helicopters thundering overhead, security rushing to reinforce barricades. Everyone knows what Trump said earlier, but now his own words are being dissected, twisted, and replayed in a way he never expected. Former BBC insiders are calling the edits deliberate, deceptive, inexcusable, and that accusation hits like gasoline on an already burning crisis. Inside the West Wing, aides are pale. Trump knows the numbers. 140 lawmakers ready to push impeachment forward, and he's already admitted it himself. If Republicans lose control, impeachment is coming. And now, it's happening in real time. But the most dangerous part isn't the vote, or the articles, or the headlines. It's what Trump decides to do next.
But something this big, where you made it seem like he said something he didn't. This is something families fall out over. I mean, people have debates around the kitchen table about what Donald Trump said and not. If you then go to a trusted source...
Friendships were ended over this as well.
Yeah, so it's just dangerous is what it is.
Do you think the Director General may need to go over this, Claire?
I don't know if Tim Davie has to go. Well, he's presiding over the BBC.
He seems to be a good man to me. I often think it's wrong that the people at the top take responsibility for the people at the bottom, but somebody needs to go.
Someone does need to go, and this is an independent report that was leaked, right? So there's no gripe in any way, shape or form, but this is really troubling.
Okay. Claire, come back and trouble us again.
I will. I will.
Lewis.
And I. The sun had barely risen over Washington, but Capitol Hill was already alive with a chaos that felt unprecedented. Sirens echoed through the streets, blending with the distant roar of helicopters circling overhead, their blades slicing through the early morning haze. Journalists rushed through corridors, cameras in hand, their breaths shallow as they captured the storm unfolding in real time. Inside the halls of Congress, the air was thick with tension. Lawmakers paced, whispered, and gestured in frantic waves, some gripping papers that could decide the future of the nation. Today was not just another day in politics. It was a showdown that would shake the very foundations of power. At the center of it all, the spotlight focused on one man, Donald Trump. His office at Mar-a-Lago felt miles away, yet his presence was palpable. Across Capitol Hill, representatives gathered, clutching copies of HRES 353, the privileged resolution that threatened to tear the administration apart. 7 articles, each more damning than the last, outlined obstruction of justice, abuse of power, violations of constitutional rights, and corruption at levels that shook the nation's trust. Every hand that touched those pages trembled, not just from fear, but from the weight of history pressing down. This wasn't political theater. This was a constitutional reckoning. In the House chamber, whispers escalated into shouts. Republicans argued, Democrats demanded, and the clock ticked on mercilessly. Outside, protesters gathered, their chants and signs forming a living wall of unrest, while law enforcement scrambled to keep the chaos from spilling onto the streets. Somewhere above it all, the press helicopters circled, their cameras capturing the unfolding crisis, broadcasting every tense moment live. There was a rhythm to it, a pulse that quickened as every vote, every motion, and every declaration drew the country closer to the edge. Suddenly, the room fell into a charged silence. The speaker raised a gavel, but the sound seemed to echo in slow motion. Phones buzzed frantically. A lawmaker's aide burst into the chamber, eyes wide, muttering that classified documents had been leaked overnight, adding fuel to an already explosive situation. The news hit the floor like lightning. Gasps, murmurs, and a few clenched fists followed. Trump, aware of the storm gathering, had made no concessions. His defiance radiated even miles away as aides reported his refusal to step down or even consider negotiation. Every strategist knew the stakes. If the Democrats gained the majority in the upcoming midterms, impeachment proceedings could ignite like wildfire. And then it happened. From the back of the chamber, a representative stood, voice rising above the chaos. "We cannot allow this to continue. The Constitution is clear. He must resign or face removal." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavier than any gavel could strike. Cameras zoomed, phones recorded, and outside, the crowd surged with a mixture of fury and anticipation. Panic and determination collided in that moment, echoing through every corner of the Capitol, making history feel immediate, almost touchable. The tension was unbearable. The Capitol had never felt so alive, or so on the brink of rupture. Each lawmaker's glance, each muttered strategy, every passing second carried the weight of national security, legal precedent, and personal ambition. Somewhere behind the walls, someone was dialing, someone else was plotting, and the nation collectively held its breath. One wrong move could spark chaos, yet inaction felt equally dangerous. And just as the first gavel of the morning was about to fall, a stunned hush rippled through the chamber. An aide whispered something that made every head snap toward the speaker's desk. The FBI was preparing an immediate federal intervention, and just like that, Capitol Hill was no longer just a center of legislation. It had become a battlefield, with history watching every moment. The first move had been made, but the game had only just begun. The air inside Capitol Hill was electric, charged with fear and determination. Every step echoed like a drumbeat of impending chaos as aides, staffers, and lawmakers scrambled to their posts. Outside, the sound of helicopters intensified, their spotlights cutting through the morning fog, illuminating barricades and surging crowds that had gathered in a mixture of protest and panic. Cameras from every angle captured the unfolding drama. This was not just news, it was history being written live. Inside the chamber, the speaker's hands trembled slightly as she prepared to call the next vote. The room was packed, every seat filled with legislators who could feel the weight of national scrutiny pressing down. Conversations had turned into debates that were barely restrained roars, accusations and counter-accusations flying through the air like sparks from a fire. HRES 353, the resolution outlining Trump's 7 articles of impeachment, sat on every desk, a tangible symbol of a country teetering on the edge. The articles detailed obstruction of justice, illegal military actions abroad, bribery, and abuse of power. The language was explicit, leaving no doubt about the stakes. Failure to act could endanger the Constitution itself. And yet, Trump remained unshaken. In his Mar-a-Lago office, he watched the chaos unfold through monitors, a calculated calm settling over him. Advisors whispered warnings, but he waved them away, confident in his strategy to maintain Republican control through the midterms. Every election day that slipped by without Democratic gains was another layer of protection for him. But outside, the momentum was building in ways even he couldn't fully control. Suddenly, the chamber doors burst open. FBI agents in full tactical gear stepped inside, their presence sending a ripple of shock through the room. Cameras zoomed in as lawmakers froze, some rising to their feet, others clutching their documents as if they were shields. The agents were here to secure sensitive materials and ensure no illegal obstruction could continue. It was an unprecedented move, federal enforcement entering the legislative chambers to safeguard the Constitution itself. The tension was palpable, a silent countdown echoing through the hallowed halls. Voices rose. "This is unconstitutional," shouted one representative. "We have the right to govern without interference." Another countered, "No one is above the law, not even the president." The debate wasn't just political. It was visceral, raw, with every argument backed by legal precedent, historical context, and sheer desperation. The clock ticked mercilessly. Every second carried the weight of national security, personal careers, and the fragile trust of millions watching from home. Outside, the crowd's roar intensified, a living wave of fury and anxiety. Sirens and drones mingled with chants and cries, creating a symphony of tension that matched the turmoil inside. Journalists scrambled to capture every word, every gesture, every shift in the room. One misplaced comment could become tomorrow's headline, shaping the narrative of a country on edge. And then, just as the first vote was about to be cast, a shocking alert flashed across every phone in the chamber. Documents proving Trump's direct interference with Venezuela operations and possibly other international actions had surfaced online, leaked in real time. Gasps filled the room. Phones buzzed. Whispers turned to stunned murmurs. The room felt like it was holding its breath. Evidence that could confirm some of the most explosive charges against the president was now public, potentially tipping the balance of power. Lawmakers froze. Some grabbed the documents, scanning the pages in disbelief. Others whispered to aides, strategizing how to react, whether to push forward immediately or wait for the political advantage. Outside, the protesters surged forward, sensing the shift in momentum. The helicopter spotlights caught faces turned toward the sky, mouths open in shock and anticipation. Every eye in the Capitol, every camera lens, every live stream was focused on this single moment, the moment where the fate of a presidency could tilt irreversibly. And then it happened. One representative, eyes wide and voice trembling, shouted, "We have confirmation. He's lied under oath." The chamber erupted. Chaos collided with strategy, panic mingled with resolve, and the first cracks in the president's shield appeared. The next few minutes would determine whether the nation witnessed a constitutional triumph or an eruption that could plunge Capitol Hill into turmoil like never before. Outside, helicopters blared warnings. Inside, shouts rose above the gavel. Every second felt like a lifetime. And as the agents began to secure the sensitive documents, the room collectively realized that nothing would ever be the same. The president's defiance, the leaked evidence, and the looming midterms had all collided into a storm that was about to break. But who would survive the first strike remained unknown. Capitol Hill had transformed into a battlefield of nerves, strategy, and raw emotion. The leaked documents were spreading like wildfire across monitors and phones, shaking every corner of the chamber. Lawmakers huddled in whispered urgency, aides scribbling notes at frantic speed, and journalists leaning over desks to catch the first unfiltered reactions. Every eye was on the speaker, who now held the gavel like a lifeline amid the storm. The president's defiance, once distant and controlled, now felt dangerously close, as if his shadow was stretching into the room itself. Outside, the crowd had grown exponentially. Tens of thousands pressed against barricades, waving signs demanding accountability, shouting chants that collided with the wailing sirens and the constant thrum of helicopters. From above, drones and press copters recorded it all: the chaos, the desperation, and the fear mingling into a living, breathing pulse of national suspense. Capitol Hill had never felt so alive, or so teetering on the edge of collapse. Inside, the tension reached a fever pitch. Representatives argued in a torrent of voices, some demanding immediate action, others warning of the political consequences. Every second seemed to stretch, each pause a countdown. Then, an aide ran in, breathless, eyes wide. "There's more," they gasped. "Financial records, direct ties to illegal foreign lobbying. These just surfaced." The chamber went silent, the collective weight of history pressing down like never before. A hush fell over the room, but it was short-lived. A Republican congressman, voice sharp and defiant, shouted, "We cannot proceed on leaks. This is a political attack." Across the aisle, a Democratic representative slammed a fist onto the desk. "These are documented abuses of power. Every second we delay, we risk the Constitution itself." The clash of ideology, urgency, and morality filled the chamber like thunder before a storm. Meanwhile, Mar-a-Lago was in chaos. Trump and his advisors frantically strategized, knowing the leaked documents could trigger the chain reaction they had long feared. Calls were made, legal teams activated, and loyalists scrambled to spin the narrative. But even their most meticulous defenses couldn't escape the growing momentum against them. In the halls of power, timing was everything, and the clock was unforgiving. Suddenly, an emergency alert lit up every device in the Capitol. Federal law enforcement had begun preparing to secure the president's private communications. This was no longer theoretical. Every motion, every whispered plan, every hand on a document could be recorded, scrutinized, and used to enforce the law. Panic surged through the room. Some lawmakers gasped aloud, others froze, the weight of responsibility pressing down like a vice. And then a young representative stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension. "We have the votes. Enough support exists to force the resolution onto the floor immediately." The room erupted. Phones buzzed furiously. Some scurried to double-check counts. Others glanced nervously at the growing crowd outside. The first move toward impeachment was no longer a threat. It was inevitable. In that moment, the chamber became a war of nerves. Every member understood that the next vote could define not just the presidency, but the nation's trajectory. Legal experts whispered about emergency injunctions. Political strategists debated timing. Aides scanned the room, anticipating the next move. Meanwhile, outside, helicopters hovered like vultures, their spotlights illuminating waves of protesters, journalists, and law enforcement, all caught in the electric suspense of a city on edge. Then, a sudden explosion of sound echoed through the building, metal doors slamming, reporters shouting, aides scrambling. Federal agents had intercepted a courier carrying sensitive communications directly tied to the president's alleged misconduct. Gasps, shouts, and hurried whispers filled the chamber. The room felt like it could erupt at any moment, a tinderbox waiting for the spark. And just as the speaker raised the gavel to call the vote, the unthinkable happened. A threat alert flashed across the Capitol security feed. Someone, or a group, was attempting to breach the building perimeter. The crowd outside surged violently, and law enforcement braced for impact. Chaos threatened to spill into the chamber itself, turning a political crisis into an immediate life-or-death situation. Capitol Hill had reached the edge. The vote was ready, the documents were exposed, and federal authorities were mobilized. But outside, the storm was closing in. The fate of a presidency, the rule of law, and the nation itself hung by a single, trembling thread. And in that heartbeat of silence before the next move, every eye in the chamber, every ear outside, waited for the explosion that would decide history. The chamber erupted into a frenzy. Alarms blared, echoing off marble walls as Capitol security moved like lightning, barricading doors and directing lawmakers to safety. Outside, the crowd had become a living tide of chaos. Voices shouting, sirens wailing, and helicopters circling like predators over a battlefield. The vote on HRES 353 hung in the balance, but suddenly, the nation's most sacred political arena had become a scene of immediate danger. Every heartbeat felt amplified, every second stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Inside, lawmakers clutched documents, eyes wide with fear and determination. Some were already dialing aides, others whispering strategy under their breaths. The speaker, gavel in hand, tried to restore order, but the tension was palpable, a fusion of panic and resolve that filled every corner. "We continue," she shouted over the din, her voice barely rising above the alarms. "We do not allow fear to dictate our duty. The Constitution demands action." Meanwhile, Mar-a-Lago had descended into calculated panic. Trump watched the chaos on live feeds, his confidence faltering for the first time. Advisors scrambled, trying to contain the growing political and legal maelstrom. Every move he had relied on, the timing of the midterms, the Republican shield, his refusal to resign, was suddenly under attack from every angle. The leaked documents, the federal intervention, and now the live threat at the Capitol had exposed cracks even his closest allies could not patch. Back inside the chamber, the first votes were cast. Hands trembled as representatives rose to speak, some condemning the president in urgent, fiery tones, others pleading for calm and caution. Each declaration, each tally, was broadcast live, feeding a nation glued to screens, holding its collective breath. Every word mattered. Every vote carried consequences that could change history. Then, the unthinkable. A coordinated breach attempt outside escalated. Barricades were tested, law enforcement pushed to the brink, and protesters surged forward. A deafening roar filled the streets, blending with the screams of panic and the whine of sirens. Inside, the chamber felt like it was vibrating with the intensity of the crisis. Security briefings came through in rapid-fire updates. An imminent threat had been neutralized, but the message was clear. The Capitol itself could be stormed at any moment. Amid the chaos, one representative's voice rang out, resolute. "We cannot let this stop us. The Constitution does not wait. The rule of law does not pause." Slowly, deliberately, votes were tallied. Each hand raised was a defiance of fear, a commitment to history over self-preservation. The room was a storm of emotion, anger, fear, duty, and resolve, all colliding in a cacophony that only Washington could contain. Then, the final vote was announced. The resolution passed. HRES 353, the impeachment measure, had cleared the House floor. The room erupted, some cheering, some staring in stunned disbelief, others weeping quietly at the weight of what had just happened. Outside, the helicopters hovered, sirens still wailing, the crowd either roaring in triumph or retreating in frustration. History had been made, but the battle was far from over. Trump's defiance was now public, his legal exposure undeniable, and the federal intervention had set a precedent that would resonate for decades. He could fight in courts, rally political allies, or attempt to spin the narrative, but the tide had shifted irreversibly. The Capitol, once just a seat of lawmaking, had become a symbol of accountability, chaos, and the enduring struggle between power and principle. And as the dust began to settle, a single thought hung over the city. No one truly knew what would happen next. Midterms, legal battles, and personal ambition would collide in ways no one could predict. One thing was certain: the nation had been irrevocably changed. Capitol Hill had erupted, the president had been challenged, and history had paused, just long enough to remind everyone that the game of power was both deadly and unpredictable.